Okay, so now I get to go back to economics for a little bit. Do you guys remember, if you remember, when we were sort of talking about the economic rebuilding after the 7 Years' War, so from sort of 1760 forward, one of the things that we talked about was that there was a relatively rapid rebuilding of the economy, but that it was done so by British elite and sort of on British principles. Okay, what you need to understand, this is sort of one of those examples of things that is a contemporary reflection of that sort of idea. And I'm going to talk about it because I think it's really important for you guys to understand, is that that economic rebuilding is the start of an economic pattern that still exists. Was documented to still exist up until 1970. So it's talking about an economic pattern that essentially existed for 200 years afterwards, which is that the economic elite, okay, even in Quebec, tended to be disproportionately Anglophone, and the sort of poor in Quebec tended to be disproportionately Francophone. We'll talk about this a lot when we talk about the Bilingualism and Biculturalism Commission, but this basically means that for 200 years, if you spoke English, you were likely to make more money. If you were likely to have a better job, you were more likely to be promoted, you were more likely to sort of be able to reach a degree of economic success. Okay? And that is a series of facts. That's a reality. What I want to talk about today is a conversation about how we understand those facts, right? You will hear me sort of talk about this a lot, that what we're doing in this class is not talking about facts, right? Like, I can ask you whether or not there's that economic disadvantage, and the answer is yes, and it's a boring question, okay? It doesn't tell us anything about how people see that and how people understand that. So one of the ways that we can understand that idea is to talk about something called Decapitation Thesis. And that's a very gruesomely named idea that comes out of sort of some economic theorists and social theorists in Quebec primarily, so Francophone social theorists, who argue that that economic pattern is the result of an intentional plan by the British, that they tried to eliminate the Francophone bourgeoisie and replace it with an Anglophone bourgeoisie. And that they did that by sort of deciding who got government contracts, right? Because if the government is all of a sudden British, then the people who have access to sort of preferential rates and sort of bidding on contracts in that sort of sense are more likely to be Anglophone. They're more likely to sort of get preferential rates. They're more likely to be able to communicate. And also, like, if you cannot occupy elected office, right? If you cannot hold civic office, if you can't be the mayor, if you're Francophone, then you cannot, for example, have the same likelihood as, for example, an Anglophone, of being able to turn your economic success into political power and to sort of generate the regulations that sort of go forward and decide, for example, how do we do procurement at the municipal level? Because if you're an Anglophone, if you speak English and you decide, for example, that one of the policies of the city is that you're only going to do calls for proposals in English, then you're making it a lot more likely that the person who gets that proposal, right, who lands the contract, is Anglophone, speaks English, because they have to have read the call for proposal to begin with, right? So they're doing it sort of that way. They're doing it through land grants to loyalists. So the loyalist immigrants who came to Canada in the sort of late 1770s, a lot of them got really good land in sort of Ontario, that's relatively rich. So there's sort of a conversation about an attempt to create an economic elite in Canada that was Anglophone. Okay, that's the idea about decapitation thesis. And one of the reasons that I talk about it in my classes in particular is not necessarily because it's 100% accurate. It's because there's no way to determine if it is or it isn't, right? We don't have any letters or documents or mind reading, I guess, from British bureaucrats from the 1700s. So we don't know what they were trying to do. Decapitation thesis is one explanation, okay? And another explanation is to sort of say that you need to understand church history to understand the economic history of New France. And what they're meaning when they say that is that there's a relatively strong current in the Catholic Church and in Catholic belief structures that suggests that wealth is fundamentally opposed to the pursuit of goodness and a connection to God, right? That you can either have material wealth or you can have a close connection with God. And therefore, the Catholic Church does a lot of encouraging people to sort of see their lives through faith rather than to see their lives through the pursuit of wealth. Okay? We can argue about whether or not that is still the case. That's not important. What is important is that if that is true, okay, if you take that as a statement, and there's a lot of sort of Catholic doctrine that you can use to back that up if you need to see it, if you take that statement as true, and you understand, and we've already sort of talked about this, the incredibly strong influence of the Catholic Church in New France, and we will talk about this a little bit later on as well, but you need to understand that for a long time in early sort of French history, what you have for the most part are communities where the only person who can read is the priest. And that means that the priest sort of serves a number of social roles, right? The priest mediates disputes. They act as sort of judge and lawyer and sort of mediator. They solve conflicts. They make decisions. If you need to write a letter to the government, you're probably asking the priest. So there's a really strong influence of Catholic Church in Francophone communities. And the counter-argument to something like Decapitation Thesis is to say that that strong Catholic influence dampened the development of a Francophone bourgeoisie, right? If you're not brought up to value the pursuit of money, why would you go through the process of becoming an entrepreneur and building factories? If you've been taught your whole life that that is going to take you farther away from God, why would you do it? And again, we can't determine that that is the case. We have to go back to the 1700s and read people's minds about what they were interested in, were not interested in doing. We can't do that. But one of the reasons that I talk about these two ideas is that they sort of illustrate something really, 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 really important, okay? Your understanding of what is going to happen today and what is a good idea, what is a bad idea, who you can trust, who you can't, all of those things are really fundamentally shaped by which one of those you believe, right? If you believe that the Francophone and Catholic culture of Quebec simply does not produce business leaders, then you look at the economic inequalities that persist into the 1970s, and you say, yeah, I guess that sounds fair. You have a culture that just doesn't produce economic gains. So, of course, the wealthier people are going to be the people who are Anglophone, who speak English. Okay, great. If, however, you believe the idea of decapitation thesis, and you believe that the reason that the Francophone economic elite doesn't exist is because the British elite intentionally destroyed it, right? They intentionally created this period of time and this set of structures that means that Francophone businesses just couldn't get off the ground. They just couldn't compete because all of the rules are changing. You need access to a whole bunch of different people in order to be able to make this work. All of those sorts of things, then you're going to read and understand those economic inequalities in the 1970s very, 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 very differently, right? Instead of sort of seeing them like, yeah, I guess that sort of happens, you're going to read them as, and it's still happening. We still haven't fixed this. So I don't care what you say about sort of the Anglophone, like about Canada being one country now. If I'm Quebecois, I'm still dealing with this kind of economic oppression because my children are still going to wind up poorer than my neighbor's children just because of the language that we speak and the religion that we practice. Those are two very different understandings about what's happening in Canada. And I'm not giving them to you because you need to choose one. And I'm not giving them to you because you need to decide which one is right. I'm giving them to you because I want you to understand that there are people in this country today who believe both of them. And that the people who believe differently about that kind of thing are going to understand a lot of Canada's history in very different ways. And that difference is an important part of understanding how these echoes continue to exist in contemporary Canada.